On behalf of the board of Villa Aurora in Berlin, I welcome you to this belated celebration of 25 years of Villa Aurora in Pacific Palisades. As you know, the real date for this anniversary was December of last year, but the symposium had to be postponed due to the pandemic, which unfortunately is still with us today. The person who was the guiding spirit for this memorial to the German exiles who were forced to flee Germany during the so-called Third Reich was no other than Martha Feuchtwanger herself, widow of Leon Feuchtwanger. The couple had left Germany in 1933 and fled via an extended stay in the south of France and after dramatic escape from concentration camps 1941 to California. They bought this house, which Thomas Mann once called a castle by the sea, and lived there for the rest of their lives. I came to California in 1975 in order to study a year at Stanford University and ended up staying 11. After my future husband Wolfgang Knepper had lured me to the Hollywood Hills, I worked in Southern California as a freelance journalist for German newspaper and radio stations. In that capacity, I met Martha at a reception at the German consulate. We immediately became friends. She reminded me of my grandmother, and I won her over with my knowledge of German literature, particularly of Bertolt Brecht, also exiled in Los Angeles. Brecht had been a close friend of the Feuchtwangers. I loved to hear her stories about her life and interviewed her several times for German radio stations. She was an incredibly brave and strong woman, had saved her husband's life a couple of times, and finally even the Villa Aurora itself during one of Southern California wildfires by simply refusing to evacuate her house and hosing down the roof so that it did not catch fire. I once asked her if she was not afraid of thieves, alone in such a big house. "Thieves do not steal books," she replied. One of my most memorable moments with her was the day I came to return the manuscript of her biography before it was published in Germany. Like always, Martha received her guests in the salon behind the living room. Unexpectedly, another lady was sitting there from Germany who complained heavily about what she felt was the lack of culture in the United States. While I could not believe such ignorance, Martha only calmly said, "Eure ganze Kultur hat euch vor Hitler auch nicht gerettet. All of your culture did not save you from Hitler." She was witty and even in her last years knew how to hit a point. Martha loved to show off Leon's extensive library and show people around the house. I introduced some of my German colleagues to Martha and Villa Aurora, among them Michaela Ullmann, who later became one of the founding members of our association and the first state secretary for culture, and Volker Skirker, who wrote a biography on Leon Feuchtwanger. He was the one who initiated the association Friends of Villa Aurora after Martha's death, because the University of Southern California wanted to sell the property. Numerous German dignitaries, former Berlin mayors, and members of parliament had also visited the villa, and Martha had charmed them into becoming enthusiasts about Villa Aurora. Thus she had created a whole group of devotees, and our project to save the villa as a cultural monument to the exiles from Nazi Germany was supported by all parties in the German parliament, despite the fact that Leon was considered a communist by some conservatives. Let me take you back for a while to the late 80s, when Germany was still divided, and exile was not a big issue. Of course, there were exile studies at some university. The Berlin Senate invited some former Berliners to visit their hometown, but their fate was not present in German society at large. Germans at the time talked about Jews and Germans as if they were different entities and did not belong together. The notion of German Jews or Jewish Germans was alien to most people. For me, though, one of my fondest memories of my years in the US is meeting some of the German Jews who had come to the United States for safe haven. Therefore, my commitment to maintaining Villa Aurora as a memorial to the exile was guided by that vision of how much those exiles had been a part of us. They were Germans just like me. When I became homesick, I decided to return to Europe. Here, family and friends were waiting for me. The Jewish emigrants to the United States had lost everything. There was nothing left for them to return to. When one of our wealthy exile friends in Los Angeles offered to host a farewell dinner for us, I had asked him to host an evening with only our exile friends, including Martha. When I told them that I would go to Berlin as correspondent for Süddeutsche Zeitung, some of them had tears in their eyes. One of the things that I had learned during the 8 years I stayed in Los Angeles was how much the Jewish immigrants had contributed to the cultural scene of Southern California. It was the conductor Otto Klemperer who put the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra on the map. The immigrants from Austria were the first art dealers who established important galleries on Melrose Avenue. And of course, there were the German writers, who gathered in such numbers in Southern California that it was called Weimar too. Heinrich Mann and Feuchtwangers were close friends. Thomas Mann lived only 5 miles away from Villa Aurora on San Remo Drive. Although they socialized and invited each other for readings from their work, Thomas Mann did not appreciate Feuchtwanger as a writer and once made a nasty remark saying something like, how one could finance such a beautiful house with such poor literature. When the first boards of Friends of Villa Aurora got together in Berlin under the chair of Lothar C. Poll, manager of the local paper Der Tagesspiegel in 1988, we wanted to maintain Villa Aurora as a memorial to all exiles in California. We wanted to continue what they had accomplished by their fate and create a cultural exchange with Southern California and Europe. And we also wanted to demonstrate that the post-war generation in Germany had learned its history lesson and understood that those driven into exile by the Nazi regime were part of our heritage. In addition to sending young artists with residency in Germany to Villa Aurora, we also established one stipend for a writer in exile. In the early years, that program was conducted in cooperation with the Getty Center, which offered a flat for these writers. Years later, we renovated a ground floor apartment in Villa Aurora for this writer, who is now called Feuchtwanger Fellow. Luckily, the idea to maintain Villa Aurora in Los Angeles was supported by all parties in the German Parliament and the Senate of Berlin. We got the money to purchase the villa from the Berlin Lottery Foundation, which later even added the funds to renovate the building and run the institution for the first 3 years. The German Parliament granted us annual funding for programs for 10 years and has since renewed its support. Little did we know how long it would take to get the necessary building permits in order to turn this residence into a cultural institution and to get the Coastal Commission to agree to the necessary renovation work. With Frank Dimster, professor at USC, we found an excellent architect who proved to be a blessing through the whole process. The renovation itself lasted until 1995. During the years of construction and establishing Villa Aurora, then German President Richard von Weizsäcker once asked me why we bought the former home of Leon Feuchtwanger and not the one of Thomas Mann. Of course, the Mann house at that time was not on the market. But when it came on the market some 20 years later, then Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, now President of the Federal Republic of Germany, got the funds from Parliament to purchase and completely renovate the building. Thanks to the excellent leadership of Markus Klimmer, who has been the chairperson of our board since 2010, Minister Steinmeier entrusted us with the administration of the Thomas Mann House. Both institutions wonderfully complement each other. While Villa Aurora continues in its mission of a more artistic program, the Thomas Mann House is more oriented towards a social, political, and scientific exchange between thinkers, scientists, and intellectuals. But both institutions are monuments to German exiles during the Nazi period. One major problem that we faced from the beginning was how to finance the institutional costs. We had program funds from the German Parliament, administered by the Foreign Office, but no institutional funding. Luckily, that changed when Michael Ullmann, one of our co-founders, became the first Secretary of Culture. He made sure that our institutional costs were covered by his office. Of course, we suffer occasionally from shortcuts and once in a while bureaucratic hurdles. But the last 25 years have been an enormous success story for a cultural institution that was founded by a private initiative and that we hopefully can carry on successfully in the future. Today, Villa Aurora is not only present in Los Angeles, but also in Berlin under the so-called Villa Aurora Forum. Our capable managing director, Heike Mertens, and her team organize exhibits, discussions, and film screenings, such as the Villa Aurora Night annually in the fall. In Los Angeles, the annual highlight is the Oscar reception, which is particularly interesting when a German film is nominated, such as The Life of Others in 2007, and even wins this prestigious award. During the pandemic, unfortunately, live events were not possible, so Villa Aurora went digital. More than 48,000 people followed our programs, actually many more than would have been able to participate in person. In the last 25 years, more than 400 artists have stayed at the Villa Aurora: writers, composers, filmmakers, photographers, screenwriters, and directors. Scholarships are funded by different institutions all over Germany, such as the Media Board Berlin-Brandenburg, the Music Board Berlin, or the Media and Film Society Baden-Württemberg, to name only a few. Villa Aurora has become a respected institution in the world of the arts. A scholarship is an honor for the artists, and we of course feel honored by the artists who carry on our mission. We are extremely grateful to all the support we get from private and particularly state institutions, and hope that support will prevail in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Well, let me introduce our first speaker, Stefan Keppler-Tasaki, who I had the honor of meeting in pre-pandemic times at the Thomas Mann House when he was a fellow there, and I'm very happy that he was able to come here all the way from Tokyo to be with us today. Stefan Keppler-Tasaki was born in 1973 in Wertheim am Main and studied German literature at the Julius Maximilians University Würzburg, and received his doctorate in 2005 on the topic of limits of the self, in Goethe's narrative fiction. From 2002 to 2008, he was an assistant professor at the University of Würzburg and at the Free University of Berlin. Subsequently, junior professor at the Friedrich Schlegel Graduate School of the Free University. In 2012, he was appointed to a tenure-track professorship for modern German literature at the University of Tokyo and has lived in the Japanese capital since then. Stefan's work focuses on Goethe and on exile writers, for example, Alfred Döblin, Thomas Mann, and many others, especially from the angle of the history of ideas and of intermedia studies. He's also repeatedly occupied himself with the history of NS ideology, not least in his region of origin in the southwest of Germany. During his student and doctorate years, Stefan was a scholarship holder of the German Academic Scholarship Foundation. From 2015 onwards, the Einstein Foundation Berlin supported his research cooperation between the Free University of Berlin and the University of Tokyo through a 5-year Einstein Visiting Fellowship. In 2019, he was also a fellow at the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles. He's a member of the Berlin-based cluster of excellent temporal communities doing literature in a global perspective. Please join me in welcoming Stefan Keppler-Tasaki.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for your kind introduction. My talk is composed of 2 parts. Part 1, remembering exile, reflecting sanctuary, and part 2, reading poems, observing trees. California has been a focus of German literature and philosophy since the days when Goethe, in 1827, envisioned a great traffic between the United States, China, and India, and Karl Marx, in 1850, predicted that the Pacific would be the future power center of the globe. These ideas fed into the thinking of such illustrious Americans as Ralph Waldo Emerson, a productive reader of Goethe and visionary of the union of East and West at the Pacific, as well as Theodore Roosevelt, a trained historian and a strategist of America's frontier in the Pacific. Alfred Döblin stood on these shores in the summer of 1945 and invoked the elegant arch of the Golden Gate Bridge as the point of entry where old Asia meets the New World and where a new era, the age of the United Nations, can begin. Accordingly, he named the literary journal he started editing in post-war Germany the Golden Gate, das Goldene Tor. While the expectations of the Pacific slope for the path of world history often reached that high, the German exiles of around 1914 arrived with few initial demands upon their sanctuary, as Mike Davis put it in his seminal study, City of Quartz, Excavating the Future in Los Angeles. Many of them felt humbled due to their incapacity to prevent the rise of National Socialism. During their exodus through Europe and Asia, the meaning of sanctuary took such acute forms as in Brecht's little house in Svendborg, Denmark, with the 4 doors to escape by, that he addressed in a 1939 poem entitled Place of Refuge. Döblin, during his weeks in a refugee camp in the south of France, frequently retreated to the Cathedral of Mons, in which he found comfort. Franz Werfel and his wife Alma Mahler fled from the bombed city of Bordeaux to the pilgrimage site of Lourdes, where they could rest for several weeks and prepare their immigration. Upon their arrival in Los Angeles, the exiles' first impressions were usually about architecture and housing. The train ride toward Union Station came with an impressive view, first of the white middle class's villa suburbs, and later the urban neighborhoods that seemed populated mainly by immigrants from China, Japan, and Mexico. The exiles' first worries were about the accommodation that they would come upon, mostly hotel rooms or apartments provided by support groups for a limited time. Their welcome meetings with friends and allies usually took place in venues such as the First Unitarian Church in Westlake, a liberal community that cooperated with the Jewish German Club of LA. The general prominence of religious sites in the picture of exile certainly contributed to the wide use of the term sanctuary, as it did in the mid-1980s, when sanctuary gained its meaning in the context of American immigration policy. Father Luis Olivares famously brought the sanctuary movement to LA by cooperating with Jewish and Protestant groups and by turning the city's oldest church, La Placita, into a sanctuary for Civil War refugees. The German exiles' diaries, letters, and autobiographies reflect a certain occupation with material culture, including such spaces as waiting rooms and ships, churches and cinemas, homes and offices. Thomas Mann's radio essay, I Am an American, broadcasted in 1914, starts with the lines, "Familiar surroundings mean much to a writer. His own desk, his accustomed books and walls, the view from the window of his study. Mann occupied himself a great deal with the architecture of his new home in Pacific Palisades, as it embodied his intact dignity in the face of expulsion and persecution. He put much effort into having his desk follow him from Munich to each station of his exile. His home is his sanctuary. That is what human rights activist Rachel Davis Dubois said about the German emigrant in 1943. A similar interest in the specifics of housing and furniture can be seen in texts of Leon Feuchtwanger. In 1943, he moved into a former model house of South Californian architecture that the LA Times had promoted in 1927. The Little Palace, later to be known as Villa Aurora, was much too big for a couple without kids. But Leon and Martha wanted it to be a place of refuge for those who were saved. Friends and acquaintances, but rare books and unique manuscripts as well. The name Aurora is consistent with the language of resistance and new beginning that Feuchtwanger, Brecht, Döblin, and other exile writers used frequently. For example, in an anthology entitled Morgenröte, that is Aurora in German, published by the Aurora Press in 1947. Virtually as soon as they arrived in LA, several of the emigre writers began to cope with their recent encounters by writing testimonial texts on the topic of flight, internment, and final escape, such as Feuchtwanger's The Devil in France and Döblin's Destiny's Journey. They wanted us not only to know about, but also to respond to their experiences, even if they had to expose their moments of painful helplessness and utter desperation. Brecht addressed later generations explicitly in his 1939 poem to those born after, quote, "Remember us with leniency." Commenting on the robust vitality of post-war Germans and their poisoned semantics of so-called inner emigration, Döblin wrote in his article Farewell and Return in 1946, "They haven't experienced yet what they have experienced. It is difficult, I would like to help." His late works were specifically designed to share experience and to create memory, however subjective and idiosyncratic they may be. In his iconic book Weimar on the Pacific, Erhard Bahr called Los Angeles an unlikely sanctuary for German exiles, given the contrast between their quite firm mindset on the one hand and the general open-mindedness of Californian society on the other. In the conclusion, headlined The Weimar Legacy of Los Angeles, he assessed the Feuchtwanger Fellowship, originally branded the Writer in Exile program, as follows. This program was created to keep alive the memory of the exiles from Weimar Germany who found sanctuary in Los Angeles. Others, like writer Jan Brandt in his 2017 collection of reports, City Without Angels, named the Villa Aurora a living museum of German exile. And while the literary texts connected to a fellowship at the artist's residence represent pretty much the breadth of contemporary German writing, one of their major concerns is to remember exile and to reflect sanctuary. A prime genre of literature from the Villa Aurora is historical novels, whose stories are located somewhere between the early 1930s and the late 1950s. The most comprehensive among them, Michael Lenz's Pacific Exile of 2007, attempts to, quote, rediscover the exile's life through the means of remembrance and fiction. More precisely, it presents the exiles, starting with Martha Feuchtwanger and ending with Katja Mann, as fellow human beings whose minds are flooded with memories. Further works of that kind include Klaus Modig's 2011 novel Sunset, that imagines the day in Feuchtwanger's life when he learned of Brecht's death, as well as Volker Harry Altwasser's 2014 narrative Happy Dying, which details the last day of Bruno Frank, one of the closest friends of the Feuchtwanger couple, as well as the Mann family. All three of these novels reflect intensively on the conditions of memory building, and they make good use of the fact that Feuchtwanger himself was in the business of historical fiction. Modig's book not only starts by quoting Brecht's Remember Us with leniency, but also elaborates on Feuchtwanger's writing technique. Quote, his instrument is empathy, the medium is the historical novel, and his prerequisite is thorough research. By this, Modig mirrors at least some of the features of his own venture. The same applies to the assessment of historical fiction as a way to address the present. Modig's Feuchtwanger considers, quote, maybe it was a mistake in the first place to write about what is going on. Maybe you need more distance, more past, more history to understand the present. Altwasser's storytelling is especially tricky since it recreates how Bruno Frank wrote his last piece of literature, a fictional autobiography by the persecuted French writer Nicolas Chamfort, entitled Chamfort Tells of His Death. Frank did not live to finish this work. In the fragment's preface, he explained, 150 years after Chamfort's death, I tried to speak with his voice. This is what Altwasser attempts to do regarding Frank, to complete this exile writer's work by emulating, if not caricaturing, his voice. The novel is entitled Happy Dying because Leon and Martha do everything to comfort their old friend. They host him on their large premises, and Leon even lies to him by announcing after a phone call that Fisher Publishing agreed to print his collected works. Relaxing on the villa's terrace, Frank contemplates 12 years of flight came to an end calmly. So at the end of the exile there was a deck chair with a view of the quiet horizon of the ocean. And why not? Of course, this safe space is only borrowed and has to be maintained through a white line. It is overshadowed by the towering figure of Thomas Mann, who never makes an entrance but radiates an aura of disapproval of his friend's literary efforts. Furthermore, the refuge allows Frank to finish his manuscript, but in the only scene of the novel that is located outside the premises, it gets suddenly lost. In Klaus Modig's Sunset, Feuchtwanger himself does not feel quite safe in his home in August 1956. Instead, he suffers from a fear growing inside him like a cancer. After many inconclusive interviews at the immigration board, he is still a German and more afraid of being expelled from his sanctuary country. He thinks of his life over the last 25 years as a waiting room that might turn out to be a lifelong prison. The doorbell of his villa begins to frighten him because he feels that it does not carry the sound of refuge, but of the arrival of eviction letters from the authorities in Washington. Going back to Germany, the torn apart country full of mass murderers, was not an option for Feuchtwanger. He was proven right by Döblin, who became the very first emigre writer to go back to Germany as early as in fall 1945, but emigrated again in 1953, frustrated about the general animosity of his fellow citizens towards former exiles. Besides these historical novels, several other works of Villa Aurora fellows include explorations of the period of exile and the issue of housing. A breathtaking example of this is Thomas Hetje's postmodern thriller and quest of identity novel, What We Are Made Of, published in 2006. It runs on the backstory of a German Jewish emigre who invented a propellant for spaceflight but kept it a secret. A modern-day German biographer, trained to slip into other people's shoes, as he assures his American publisher, studies the life of this scientist. "I don't want to make something up," he declares about his work ethics. "I want to know what we are made of." For the scientific secret, he falls victim to blackmail by a private spaceflight investor and is chased from New York to LA. As he becomes a refugee of crime, he allows himself to identify with the subject of his research, the Jewish refugee of 1941. This coping mechanism reflects his insecurities of identity and provides him with a kind of psychological hideout. It is worth mentioning that this biographer's name is Niklas Kalf, because his German family name reminds of the English word calf, as in the animal. Calf points to a naive person or greenhorn, and at the same time to a creature that is likely to be slaughtered. One of the stops on his way across the continent is a certain estate at 5020 Paseo Miramar, the actual address of the Villa Aurora. The property owner is the scientist's widow, and while her name is Elsa, the narrator calls her just once Martha, to give away the model for this character. Elsa/Martha explains the architecture of the Palisades neighborhood as follows. "All of this is a little paranoid. Everyone is copying something. But all these dreams are directed exclusively inwards because everything that is outside cannot be trusted. Armed response, fear everywhere is fear." Southern California as a landscape of trauma, a traumascape, in which people relive earlier fears and develop new ones, is a major pattern in writing about Los Angeles. As Tanya Dückers put it in her 10-year anniversary article on the Villa Aurora in 2005, the metropolis presents itself as a theme park of risks, involving wildfires, flooding, earthquakes, and animal attacks, among other things. Jan Brandt, in City Without Angels, tells about his nightmares in which people are kidnapped. In addition, he experiences a Freudian misreading when he sees a recommendation regarding visiting hours. It says, "beat the crowds," meaning avoid the rush hour, but he reads it as "beat the crowds," meaning beat the Germans. The various projects of Californian architecture from the 1920s to the 1950s to design fear-free houses for the few and the many is one of the topics of Kevin Vennemann's creative nonfiction book Sunset Boulevard, Filming, Building and Dying in Los Angeles, that came out in 2012. It navigates, like Sunset Boulevard itself, in elegant meandering between film locations of noir movies and important architectural sites. One of the first films mentioned is Irving Lerner's City of Fear, whose title appears against the backdrop of LA at night. Among the concepts of architecture that Vennemann excavates is the ambition, quote, to finally fulfill the promise of Southern California paradise, be it through the Spanish mission style, as exemplified by the Feuchtwanger estate, or California modernism as demonstrated by works of Rudolf Schindler and Richard Neutra, architects who, quote, both fled the aesthetic and political dead end of Europe around 1920. However, Vennemann's observations address how the mission style whitewashed colonial repression and how California modernism ended up in some isolated treasures of housing, adored artifacts that could neither form neighborhoods nor develop the social impact once intended. It is important to see that all the reflections on exile mentioned above are deeply entangled with observations on the much broader spectrum of migration and mobility. In Modick's Sunset, Feuchtwanger takes an interest in the family history of a Santa Monica tailor, a descendant of European Jews who came to America at the end of the 19th century. Also, he occupies himself with the history of a Bavarian butcher's shop in West Hollywood. In Altwasser's Happy Dying, most of the amenities of the Feuchtwanger estate depend on the labor of the Latino house staff. The German traveler in Hetje's What We Are Made Of is tempted to stay in America, to become part of this country forever, and to live, quote, in the center of the world, even if this world as it was wouldn't exist for much longer. As a kind of happy ending, his son gets born in LA, making him a citizen of Rome. The narrator of Vennemann's Sunset Boulevard finally flees the sin of believing in a human-made paradise in Southern California to seek forgiveness in New York City. I now come to part 2 of my talk, reading poems, observing trees. We may wonder about the ominous tone that Hetje's narrator uses when talking about a changing world and shifting or dissolving centers. Goethe's and Marx's predictions about the Pacific Age come to mind as a source for such rumors. More specifically, the protagonist of What We Are Made Of keeps quoting the poem by the post-communist intellectual Heiner Müller that reads as follows. Villa Aurora. Die Bäume verneigen sich vor dem Wind vom Pazifik, der Bescheid weiß, über die Dauer der Millionenstadt, waiting for doomsday, unconscious of its fate rising from past and Asia. I translate this. Villa Aurora, the trees bow before the wind from the Pacific that knows about the duration of the metropolis, wartend auf den jüngsten Tag, unbewusst ihres Schicksals, das aufsteigt aus damals und Asien. This code-switching elegy on Los Angeles is the very first literary text written in the Villa Aurora after its conversion into an artist's residence. At that time, in early 1995, Müller was a fellow of the Getty Center, but as he expressed in his poem entitled Welcome to Santa Monica, he did not like his hotel accommodation. A successor to Brecht's throne at the Berlin Ensemble, and also a patient suffering from final stage cancer, he was given the opportunity to move into the Villa Aurora about 9 months before its first fellows arrived. He got company at the villa by his friend Frank M. Radatz, a stage director and later on the editor of Müller's collected statements on the American Leviathan, as they called the United States. By the same pathos, Radatz located Müller's thinking of that time beneath the dying star of utopia and in the middle of a post-utopian situation of mixed elements. The title of this poem seems simple enough and practically inaugurates the renewed brand of Villa Aurora. In its 5-line structure and by its laconic, distant tone, it clearly invokes Brecht's Hollywood Elegies, a cycle of poems written in 1942. The 5 lines of Hollywood Elegy number 4, for example, run as follows. Under the green pepper trees, the musicians walk the streets 2 by 2 with the white writers. Bach has a string quartet in his pocket. Dante swings his skinny butt. By the green pepper trees, Brecht's poem refers to what is also known as the California pepper tree, like this specimen here in the garden of the Thomas Mann House. It represents an evergreen species that is as iconic to the Californian landscape as the palm trees, to which Müller's poem alludes to, where it says, the trees bow before the wind, because that is what palm trees tend to do. They lean toward the prevailing breeze, like in this picture taken in Koreatown. The elegy by Müller moves from 3 lines in German to 2 lines in English, as if its voice comes from a German-speaking background and enters into an English-speaking one. It starts by indicating the location, the Villa Aurora, as a viewpoint that is somewhat detached from the world, but allows a special oversight. At first, the gaze covers elements of nature, trees and the wind from the Pacific. They are both anthropomorphic. The trees bow as if they adhere to proper Asian manners. The wind knows as if it possesses the proverbial Asian wisdom. In the center line, the angle turns to elements of civilization, the metropolis, history, and geopolitics. The metropolis is also anthropomorphized since it waits for its own doomsday and seems to have an unconsciousness. The doomsday scenario is not so much a revenge fantasy of an East German intellectual in the aftermath of the communist collapse. As Mike Davis in the chapter The Noirs of City of Quartz famously pointed out, the boomtown of Los Angeles has been haunted from early on by fears of doom. However, the fate summoned in the poem is not necessarily identical with the day of judgment expected by the metropolis itself. It could be any alternate future. Müller's intellectual ancestors, such as Brecht and Adorno, looked at LA as the crystal ball of capitalism's future. This is how Davis phrased it in his chapter on the German exiles, the very chapter that follows the Noirs. In the last line of the poem, the idea of something rising leads back to the keyword in the title, Aurora. Similarly, the notion of Asia points back to the first line, where the trees seem to display Asian etiquette. Instead of a rising sun, though, we are faced with a rising fate emerging both from the past and Asia. Regarding the notions of past, the poem echoes once again the prominent book by Mike Davis, whose German translation, City of Quartz, Ausgrabung der Zukunft in Los Angeles, was published in the fall of 1994 by a small neo-Marxist press in Berlin. Prepended to the body of Davis's work is a quote by Walter Benjamin from his philosophical memoir Berlin Childhood around 1900. It says, "To portray a city, a native must have motives of one who travels into the past instead of into the distance." Following Benjamin's guideline for his exploration of Berlin, Davis starts his journey at the ruins of the city of Llano del Rio, a socialist colony founded in LA County in 1914 and abandoned in 1918. The past of Los Angeles, as viewed by Davis, is the history of corrupted promises and abundant utopias. It relates to the socialist project on which Ruins Heiner Müller stood, following the German reunification that he did not support. How does Asia come into the landscape of our poem? Popular fiction from that time, such as Michael Crichton's 1992 novel Rising Sun and its movie adaptation with Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes from the following year, reminds us of the social fears that Japan and Japanese corporations caused in the Reagan era. In foreign politics, the American pivot to Asia announced itself with the founding of the APEC organization in 1989, that the People's Republic of China subsequently joined in 1991. Otherwise, Heiner Müller's outlook on Asia from the Villa Aurora seems to mirror, once again, text traditions from exile. During the few years before and after writing the Hollywood Elegies, Brecht worked on another cycle of poetry entitled Chinese Poems. The first version was published in 1938, but Brecht started amending the cycle after moving to Santa Monica and receiving a volume with translations of Chinese poetry in November 1944. At all the locations where he spent his exile, Brecht famously marked his working space with a picture of Confucius, the great sage and teacher, on the wall behind his desk. Confucius in Santa Monica. This made sense to Brecht since he used Chinese philosophy starting as early as 1920 and continuing through his life as a relief from Marxism, activism, and the urge for progress. Evidently, Heiner Müller knew Brecht's works from the inside out, and he made sure to reflect exile poetry such as the Hollywood Elegies and the Chinese poems when he composed Villa Aurora. Moreover, with the poem's view from the height of the hill over a panorama of landscape and history, Müller practically occupied the very space from which Brecht enjoyed views like in this picture from 1945. The elegy Villa Aurora became a starting point for the vast amount of contemporary literature that has been inspired by residence days at this institution ever since. The first regular writer in residence of the program was Irina Liebmann. Like Heiner Müller, Liebmann had been a citizen of the GDR. She was born in Moscow in 1943 and majored in Chinese studies from the University of Leipzig in 1966. In the years prior to her fellowship, she built herself a reputation as a writer who contributes significantly to the literary image of the city of Berlin, particularly of its downtown neighborhoods. Less than a year after her stay at the villa, she published a collection of poems by the puzzling title of Pervomaisk, Mayday, and La 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 LA. In this work, she focuses on contrasts between Russia during the First Chechen War and the urban life of Los Angeles. Her point of view is located in Berlin, more precisely in dirty, 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 dirty Berlin, where she yearns for returning to LA because, as it says in the final lines of the collection's first poem, everyone who I want to see again is there. On the 15th anniversary of the residence program in 2010, the Villa Aurora Society edited a booklet with poems by Liebmann, humorously headlined, "Learning to Drive a Car in LA." The earlier volume already indulged in the flow of traffic on Wilshire Boulevard, where the polished fronts of the buildings, the glitter edges, quote, carefully guard the streams of the cars as good as a bed. Learning to Drive a Car in LA reassembles the motives of traffic into the following poem. The palms on 9th Street, they've grown too tall, much too tall. The palms of 9th Street wave their brush tree tops crests on their pencil stakes way up high, and all stand askew to one side. They stand left and right of the sidewalks, and then again they stand straight just when I passed. Yes, the first day I drove alone in a borrowed car through Holy Monica, cautious and also not proper. Just one corner before I had almost run into a woman who came from the right. Thank God so many women here drive these cars here everywhere. They don't complain, they grin. And then to the left I saw the palms of 9th Street. The driver in this poem seems to be continuing a trip that she began in the 1996 volume by featuring mainly Wilshire Boulevard. She changed to Arizona Avenue and is headed toward the ocean. Fittingly, the cover of the booklet shows the Santa Monica Pier entrance as seen through a windshield. While the view in Heiner Müller's Villa Aurora is a panoramic one, looking down from the hill, the view here is from the middle of things upwards toward the tops of the palm trees. As in Müller's poem, these trees lean to one side, not so much to create a rising future, but to reach the sky and paint it like a brush. Villa Aurora summoned an unknown fate of the metropolis, whereas learning to drive a car in LA calls upon a particular god in Holy Monica, who is addressed in Liebmann's earlier collection too. Quote, "Dear God of Wilshire, help me. I mean the god of Wilshire Boulevard." This god of Wilshire Boulevard appears to be a god of mobility. He is called upon to spirit away Liebmann's persona from Berlin to LA. In the terms of a playful mythology, Liebmann found a voice to express sympathy for Los Angeles as a sanctuary. Thank you for your attention.
We now have a few minutes to ask Stefan Keppler-Tasaki, thank you so much, questions, and maybe while you think about your questions, I can start with one, if you don't mind. You pointed out how important architecture, housing, even furniture was for many exiled authors, such as Thomas Mann, who brought his desk here, and Feuchtwanger. And having lived in the Thomas Mann house yourself and having been at the Villa Aurora, And having researched many of the writers in residence at Villa Aurora, what would you say is the importance or the impact that these historical spaces, Jan Brandt calls Villa Aurora a museum of exile, have on contemporary writers? What can writers find here that they might not find anywhere else?
Yeah. And as Stefan Schneider pointed out, these houses can be haunted by noble spirits who can be inspiring. And at the other hand, if we look at this Villa Aurora poem by Heiner Müller, it's full of quotations from other texts. It refers to Mike Davis, several times it refers steadily to Bertolt Brecht, and then that raises the question, why travel abroad at all? When if there is no world outside the texts anyway, why to promote or to encourage writers or scholars for that matter to go abroad? But and there are writers, of course, who say I don't need this kind of experience. One of the most prolific writers of novels on Japan in Germany, for example, he has never been to Japan. And he says he doesn't need that, it's all in the books, right? On the other hand, when you look at Heiner Müller, he had to come. He had to come to replace Brecht, as he did before in Berlin at the Berlin Ensemble Theatre Company. And in that sense, I think, so material culture, it can help you. Reliquaries maybe like this piece of furniture that is Feuchtwanger's podium actually. I mean, it helps you connect. It's always problematic to think you can connect easily to the past, and it's always problematic to think that you can identify with people from the 1930s, 1940s. There's a trap there, and well, Kevin Vennemann is somebody who's very careful and who reflects much in his prose about how we can, connect to the past without identifying, for example, with victims, and by that, helping ourselves emotionally by identifying in a wrong or improper way, and how we can relate to history without pretending to understand that history. But nevertheless, I would say the material culture objects, they help in a quite sober way, right? To relate and so much.
Yeah. And in your opinion, what is the purpose of residency programs such as the one at Villa Aurora? And what kind of art or literature should they foster, in your opinion? Obviously, everybody has a different take on that.
That's an excellent question, also because Villa Aurora is part of a global network of similar artist residencies, alongside Villa Massimo in Rome, very dear to me, Villa Kamogara in Kyoto in Japan, and also Villa Tarabya in Istanbul. And you see in this global network, it's a carefully composed, right? There's one residence program to go along the European unification process, Villa Massimo in Rome since the 1950s. There's Villa Aurora for the transatlantic dialogue. There is Villa Tarabya in Istanbul as a gateway to the Arab world, and there is Kyoto as a culture as a capital of Asian culture. And the German government made sure to compose this kind of global network. And I think one of their aims is to internationalize their own artists and writers and scholars, of course, to help them making an entrance into the international art and writers scene. Another purpose might be to try to use the arts and literature, well, to observe globalization, right? To get them in that process of globalization and to try, well, to understand through art and literature emerging from this kind of residences, to understand, or at least to observe the dynamics of globalization. And maybe one can be so bold to think that maybe through that kind of programs you could even try to shape globalization.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, Stephen also talked about the networks that the artists at Villa Aurora have forged, and I can speak to this myself from USC. I see so many, particularly the Feuchtwanger Fellows, come through and forging networks and informing us also, right, about things that don't go on in our own bubble. I want to see if we have any questions in the audience. There's one.
It makes me wonder, do you think Germany is a bit more on the forefront due to our, exile push? Is our modern literature more forced to be more global, or do other countries in Europe have the same or similar drive to do these things?
I think Switzerland was even earlier in that process to foster that kind of residence programs worldwide. Switzerland is a rather small country, meant to bring their artists to New York and to other places. But well, the 1990s were an important time to establish that kind of residencies. And then, well, Villa Kamogawa and Villa Tarabya, they were both founded in 2010. So that was 5 years prior to the major immigration of 2015 following. And well, certainly the observation on immigration in Europe and trying to come up, maybe not with solutions, but with concepts of getting a grasp of just to understand immigration. This urge was certainly an incentive for artists, writers to make use of that kind of programs abroad, particularly at the Villa Aurora, since the United States is the only immigration society of these 4 programs. And what we have seen in the last 6 years or so is particularly in the fiction and in the reports, articles emerging from the Villa Aurora, is certainly a certain focus on immigration, migration, mobility, nomad life. So nomad of 4 continents, that's a novel, or rather a report book, a nomad of 4 continents, a book by Ilya Troyanov that deals with nomadic life in the 19th century, or just processes of immigration as regular as the steady flow of Germans, for example, into the United States since the 19th century. So where, for example, 2 fellows of Villa Aurora, Jan Brandt again, one of them, came up with the idea to write novels about German immigration since the 19th century to the United States, and they tried to get a sense for immigration society, how that looks like, how people deal with heritage, how they build a heritage, help them to stay here. Thank you very much for the question.
Any other questions from the audience? I don't want to dominate the discussion. Yeah.
This is not a question. I just wanted to mention that yesterday I ordered a book entitled by an art historian, Turks, Jews, and Other Germans in Contemporary Art, which is making the argument for the fact that Germany already has become a sort of cosmopolitan center. And goes, basically it's going to be portraits of 24 artists showing that it's already projecting that into the world. Just seems to follow from what you're saying.
Any other questions? If I may, otherwise ask one more. For me, it was fascinating to see how many of the novels written by the writers in residency at Villa Aurora, they seem to rewrite or provide a continuation or even an alternative ending to the story of the exiles, such as Michaela Ullmann's Pacific Exile, or Klaus Modek's Sunset, or even Harry Volker Altwasser's Happy Dying. As someone who's so familiar, and I know you've researched many of the German-speaking exiles, who would be a protagonist that you would enjoy, seeing being picked up and hearing maybe like an opportunity, maybe having an opportunity to give them like an alternative ending or to continue telling their story?
What already happened is that somebody like Michaela Ullmann put the wives of the great men more to the foreground, like, well, Martha and Katja. And I think the next step would be, and that's by personal interest of mine, well, to put forward this other migrant communities that the German immigrants get in contact with. For example, it's side figures. There are always this kind of Latino house stuff and so on. Well, Katja and Thomas Mann, they had for 2 years a Japanese couple from 1945 to 1947. Japanese couple where she was the cook for the Mann family and he was the gardener for that large, back then even larger premises of the Mann family. And maybe at some point to put out these figures. And well, I would really be interested, would really be eager to see a writer using his imagination, not much enough of it, for that to figure out how that must have been, right? Or how you can imagine that, how so that, like that of the Manns, how they interrelated, for example, Mann family and the housekeepers.
That is something I would also like to see very much. And I mean, fortunately, in exile studies, we can see a slight uptake in having more stories of the women behind the great men, and also the women exiles who made a career here in Los Angeles. So we can see there's a little bit more, but really just recently, and still not enough. So I would really like to see more of that as well. And yeah, like to say, like the side characters or the people who are not in the limelight yet, but who also still have like important contributions to make. So hopefully we'll see more of that as well. Any other questions? If not, I think we have to also move on. Yes. So then, thank you so much, and thank you so much, Stefan.
Well, I'm switching into my role as a moderator for the following reading by writer Kevin Vennemann that will be followed by a Q&A. Before he begins his reading, I would like to say a few words regarding his work and career. Kevin used his college years to study German literature and related fields at several prominent universities and interesting places around Germany and Austria. He first built himself a reputation as an explorer of new forms of writing when he published his historical narrative Close to Jedenev, Nahe Jedenev, in 2005. Recent research even coined the term Vennemann principle to describe Kevin's extremely cautious and yet radical ways to get in touch with history without pretending to comprehend it. Among several distinctions he has been awarded for his comprehensive oeuvre, Kevin received the Villa Aurora Fellowship in 2008, as well as the Villa Kamogawa Fellowship 7 years later. His time as a writer in residence at the Villa Aurora had at least two effects. Firstly, it fed into his work on the book entitled Sunset Boulevard, on filming, building, and dying in Los Angeles, that came out in 2012. Secondly, he began a new life in the United States, received his PhD from NYU in 2015, and got appointed to a tenure-track position at Scripps College in LA County in the following year. Kevin, thank you for being here today and sharing your perspective on Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Claudia Gordon, for everything. It's nice to see you all. And happy birthday. I almost forgot. Happy birthday. Can you hear me okay? All the way in the back? Yeah? Thank you. All right. So yes, I'll be reading the first couple of pages of the book that Stefan mentioned. It's called Sunset Boulevard. It was written in German. The title translates to Sunset Boulevard of Filming, Building, and Dying in Los Angeles. It's a collection of essays on race and architecture and space and, I don't know, the representation of marginalized communities in LA and in films about Los Angeles. It was written 10 years ago, 11 years ago. A lot has happened since, but it is what it is. These are going to be the first 10 or 12 pages maybe. Just two warnings before I get started. I'm going to be throwing a lot of clips and images at you. It's maybe too much, I don't know, but 29 minutes and then it will be over. It's a very quick, very painful though. And the other thing is maybe, and by way of a trigger warning, these are classical Hollywood films, and they're extremely white. It's disturbing, and the casual misogyny in these films is equally disturbing. I have only one bad clip. I think I will give you a heads up, and I think that's what I wanted to say. Before I get started, let me maybe do a quick land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the land which we occupy today as the traditional home of the Tongva, Quiche, and Chumash tribal nations. These are sovereign people which have been the caretakers of this land since time immemorial. Despite centuries of genocide and occupation, these communities continue as vibrant and resilient tribes and bands, both federally recognized and non-recognized. I'd like to also acknowledge the generations that have gone before, and as well present-day Tongva, Quiche, and Chumash people.
Yes, this is Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles, California. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning. That's the homicide squad, complete with detectives and newspapermen. A murder has been reported from one of those great big houses in the 10,000 block. You'll read about it in the in late editions, I'm sure. You'll get it over your radio and see it on television. Because an old-time star is involved. One of the biggest. But before you hear it all distorted and blown out of proportion, before those Hollywood columnists get their hands on it, maybe you'd like to hear the facts, the whole truth. If so, you've come to the right party. You see, the body of a young man was found floating in the pool of her mansion, with 2 shots in his back and 1 in his stomach. Nobody important, really. Just a movie writer with a couple of B pictures to his credit. The poor dope. He always wanted a pool. Well, in the end, he got himself a pool. Only the price turned out to be a little high.
Yes, applause. It's a great film and such a good start. It's the year 1950, of course, and Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard opens with the body of Joe Gillis. We are watching him from below as he's floating with his eyes wide open, as wide as saucers, in the swimming pool of a splendid mansion opened by the former silent movie star Norma Desmond. Cops at the edge of the pool, reporters. A narrator reassures us on this early morning that only he is reporting the entire truth about this murder case, as opposed to the gross exaggerations of Hollywood tabloids. It's Joe Gillis himself who is telling us this story of his very own death, and he's doing so from within the good old off, which is so very essential to so many films noir of the time. Gillis is telling his story quite tranquilly, if you will, which is surprising considering that he's a dead man and he really should be quite upset about that. But then again, he has been drifting in the pool for quite some time now and might have gotten used to it. Never in a million years would he have expected that Norma Desmond's furious jealousy would amount to 3 shots from her revolver. Death is quite visible in his puffy face now, but mostly their surprise. Behind him, the morning sun rises and the day begins. The young scriptwriter Joe Gillis died a death which is so very typical for any story about the city of Los Angeles of this time, 1950. Just as typical, probably, as the emerging cliche that Los Angeles and Hollywood are nothing if not forever enticing and destructive. Around the time when Billy Wilder made Sunset Boulevard, just before Hollywood's post-war boom, and while the studios were suffering from their very first economic and artistic slump since the end of the silent era, around this time, not even talent and luck and not even connections and tenacity suffice for Joe Gillis or for his hopeful peers to embark on a big career or on just any career. By train, by bus, by car, by train, by car, by bus, they came to Hollywood in search of a dream, is the subtitle of John Schlesinger's 1975 adaptation of Nathaniel West's novel, The Day of the Locust. But nobody ever fully arrives in Los Angeles, and neither does country bumpkin Joe Gillis. All he can do is travel here, and upon arrival, he keeps on traveling. When Gillis, who was planning to prospect for luck and fortune in Los Angeles and for his redemption on Earth, when this Joe Gillis finally decides to return home to Ohio, he must content himself with 2 bullets in his back, with 1 in his stomach, and with his end as a water corpse in the very same pool he always wanted. Apart from Norma Desmond's late pet monkey, Gillis is the only body in Sunset Boulevard, but he's far from the first or even the only victim of the Southern California surrogate paradise on Earth. As explains John Malkovich in 2008 in Clint Eastwood's Changeling in 1928.
Every day, new bodies appear along Mulholland and in the ditches of our cities, the work of Police Chief James Davis and his aptly named gun squad. Every day, the needs of honest citizens are put second to greed and personal gain. Every day, this city sinks deeper into a cesspool of fear, intimidation, and corruption. Once the city of angels, Los Angeles has become a place where our protectors have become our brutalizers, where to be the law is to be above the law.
And the only one really who's to blame for the fact that it has come this far in the first place is someone called Johnny Guitar.
Got any eggs?
Top shelf.
Get
Let him get them. He's eating them. Crawling on that bridge and cutting that rope. That was a real brave thing to do, Mr. Logan. How are you going to thank him, Vienna?
He hasn't asked for any thanks.
Yeah, but he expects plenty, don't you, Mr. Logan?
Sit down, Johnny.
Let him stand. Look at him, Vienna. Can't wait to shoot me. Fingers just itching on the trigger. Huh. Nice fella. You finally got someone to do your killing for you. That'll make you real happy.
Sit down, Johnny. We've both done a lot of living. Our problem now is how to do a little more.
This Johnny Guitar is an average gunslinger, a gangster with just enough dignity to serve as a hero for 95 minutes and not a minute longer. In Nicholas Ray's Western Johnny Guitar, we are part of Johnny's entourage when we get stuck all of a sudden in a tiny hamlet somewhere in Arizona, which mostly consists of Vienna's bar and Vienna's ambitious hopes that at some point soon just about every train headed for the West Coast will be running through town and past her bar just right by the station platform. Johnny Guitar, during the concluding showdown, he must decide what's next for him and for us and for his three cronies, and just where exactly he's going to lead us all next, all the way back to his hometown, to New York, or is he going to move on from Arizona to California, and just about when we, in his entourage, are ready to exclaim, "Back to New York, please," he has already decided. There's just no way in hell he's going to go back to the Old East. Instead, he decides to move on as quickly as possible, as far away as possible from what has always already been way too long a past. Johnny Guitar's dramatic and bloody showdown and Johnny's crucial decision to move on mark an origin story, if you will. With Johnny Guitar in 1954, director Nicholas Ray throws us back way into the past 70 or 80 years, back into a time when the white Protestant East Coast is just about to realize the enormous weight of its European past, and that this heavier burden may only be shaken off on the way to a supposedly innocent West Coast Arcadia. In 1948, more than 70 or 80 years after Johnny's decision, Kitty Berman is just about to leave the office of a private investigator in The Two Jakes when she turns around one last time to ask,
"Jake?"
Mrs. Berman?
Does it ever go away?
What's that?
Past.
Well, I think you have to work real hard on that one.
the past never really goes away. Johnny Guitar's past, of course, has accompanied him on his long way from a very mundane East Coast all the way to Los Angeles and into Los Angeles, and it will accompany him on every single future attempt to get out of Los Angeles again. As soon as Johnny arrives, his past is already there. And even if he really wanted, there is nothing he could possibly do to prevent his past from infiltrating the city over the decades to come. It's for this reason that Jack Nicholson's private investigator, 70 or 80 years later, must correct himself after all.
Catherine?
It never goes away.
Past never goes away. We don't get to witness Johnny's actual arrival in California. 20 years after Johnny Guitar, however, Sterling Hayden, who played Johnny, now plays a novelist in Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye, as the epitome of everything that Los Angeles does to those who have embarked on the naive journey to cinematic redemption on Earth. Hayden's character is disfigured by a drinking habit and by jealousy. He is choleric, violent, desperate, possibly even a killer. In the end, he disappears forever in the Pacific Ocean right outside his Malibu bungalow. Just around the year 1900, the man-made paradise on Earth had only just begun to flourish when it's already rotting. The following decades are dominated by real estate and oil market boosters who rule and justify just about anything: police violence and corruption, white supremacy, racial segregation, ghettoization, and crime. The studios, however, continue to conjure up innumerable dreams and hopes just about as quickly as they destroy them. Vince Riker, for instance, here in City of Fear in 1959, is on the run from the police somewhere far outside the city. A newscaster announces that Riker is presumed to be headed south for Mexico, but Riker has other plans.
Vince Riker is 6'1", brown curly hair and brown eyes. They are believed headed south.
All the way to LA, Daddy.
All the way to LA, Daddy. He has never even planned to leave. And he grins and summarizes the entire dream project Los Angeles with only a few words when he remarks about his deceased partner.
Hey. At least you got a nice, clean ambulance. It's more than some of us get.
30 or 40 years after Johnny Guitar's arrival, in 1919, Harry Leon Wilson's Merton of the Movies opens a long sequence of skeptical or even critical coming to Los Angeles novels. Mark Lee Luther's The Boosters follows in the 1920s, and so do Carl von Fechten's Spiger Boy, Carol and Garrett Graham's Queer People, and of all these early literary renditions of the very rotten urban hell that Los Angeles is supposed to have become at this point, it's really only Luther who treats some of his characters to a happy ending, and even to the fulfillment of most of their dreams. Noir begins, and it's Mike Davis, we have already heard about his work, whose seminal study City of Quartz introduces the term LA Noir for a whole range of narratives set in Los Angeles that have been dismantling Los Angeles since the mid-1920s. LA Noir. A panorama of perennial rain, it's always nighttime, not a single one of those infamous palm trees in sight that are not even native to California anyway. The ocean and beach only appear on a few occasions in daylight, and exclusively for just as long as things have not turned entirely sour for the protagonist. LA Noir presents the city as a historical void without any morale. In 2006, the director Robert Town adapts John Fonte's novel Ask the Dusk, one of the great coming to Los Angeles novels in the early 1930s. A monologue captures everything that this first generation of critical novelists and filmmakers set out to say about the once glamorous metropolis. Arturo Bandini, a writer, hopeful like so many, but unsuccessful like so many more, talks about a woman, then about Los Angeles, and then again about a woman.
She's perfect. Like the weather. Air and fog. Eucalyptus. Dusty sunlight. Perfect place to live. Then we come along. Dig for gold, drill for oil, get into the movies, build these crappy hotels and dirty streets. We don't even come here to live. We just dig it up, mess it up, and grab whatever we can get. This is her home. If God had any sense or decency, he'd blow us all to hell and leave her home the way it was. Pure and perfect. Like her.
If God had any decency, he'd blow us all to hell and leave her home the way it was, pure and perfect. This self-destructive desire is the most common denominator of all of LA Noir. There are plenty of ways in which Hollywood imagines its own destruction. Nuclear disasters, for instance, in Kiss Me Deadly. There are alien invasions in Battle Los Angeles. There's future destruction, or destruction by agents sent from the future in Blade Runner, for instance, or of course in The Terminator. There's military isolation against the rest of the world in Escape from LA. There's the destruction by wildfires in Lakeview Terrace, and there's even destruction by fruit flies in Shortcuts. And of course, destruction by earthquakes in Earthquake. LA Noir either imagines the collective cathartic deliverance from Los Angeles itself and from what was supposed to be redemption on Earth, or LA Noir hopes to escape the horrors head over heels. There's LA Confidential, for instance, barely sufferable, now 25 years after it came out, for its racism, which makes, however, one argument after the other for the fastest possible escape from paradise. In the 3 or 4 years that have passed since Joe Gillis's death in Sunset Boulevard, the desire to get out of here has become only more urgent. At the end of LA Confidential, depleted by all that unfulfilled California dreaming, we finally get to return home to some dump in Arizona. It might be the same place where Johnny Guitar, decades ago, made the fatal decision to continue traveling. Everyone is trying to get out. In The Long Goodbye, for instance, Eileen Wade escapes to Europe. In Strangers When We Meet, family man Larry Coe escapes all the city's temptations, and we look forward with him and his family to a future on Hawaii. Kay Lake, in The Black Dahlia, moves to her hometown Boston. Snake Plissken escapes the prison that Los Angeles has become an escape from LA. Faye Greener disappears in The Day of the Locust, who knows where to. And Jackie Brown in Jackie Brown buys a plane ticket for the first best flight to Spain. These are the ones who escape. Most others don't get to. Like a certain Lieutenant Hoover says in Mulholland Falls before he throws a mafia boss down a gorge in the Hollywood Hills.
This isn't America, Jack. This is LA.
And then to an FBI agent from Washington, D.C., and this is the bad clip in this presentation. For the language.
See, that's federal property. This isn't. This is LA. This is my town. Out here, you're a trespasser. Out here, I can pick you up, burn your house, fuck your wife, or kill your dog. And the only thing that'll protect you is if I can't find you. And I already found you.
And when Los Angeles has found us in Los Angeles, this is what the clip seems to say, then it may just be the case that it won't let us leave again. Joe Gillis in Sunset Boulevard, at some point, he wants to make a decision. And then he decides against everything, against his beloved Betty, and against the movie script they have been working on, against Norma Desmond, of course, his mentor and torturer, but especially against the possible movie career in Hollywood. It might well be the case that those who were never supposed to come to Hollywood and or Los Angeles in the first place never truly get to arrive, which does not mean, however, that either Hollywood or Los Angeles is going to let these failed newcomers leave again. There's In a Lonely Place, for instance. Dixon Steele, Humphrey Bogart, and Laura Gray are two of the most exhausted characters in all of Los Angeles noir. Dixon is a scriptwriter for the studios, and Laurel used to be a very talented, aspiring actress, until she gives up all of her ambitions when Dixon accepts her into his house. But here in this clip is Dixon's agent on a surprise visit, and we quickly learn how determined Hollywood is to refuse anyone's departure. Once you have tried to arrive, you don't get to leave again, at least not alive.
Snooping through windows. And in broad daylight, too. Where are your manners, Mr. Lippman?
Don't tell Dix. He might get the idea I'm checking on him.
Come in.
No, he shouldn't be disturbed.
Oh, yes, he should. He hasn't stopped working all night. He hasn't left the house in days. Won't even take me for a drive.
Incredible. You know, Dix hasn't been able to work like this since before the war. What do you use? Witchcraft?
Only as a last resort. He's kind of dopey this morning. I love him that way. Come on, I'll show you. Dixon.
Huh?
Mel is here to take you to the beauty contest.
I'll be ready in a minute.
He thinks you'll be voted Mr. America.
Good.
Are you really the handsomest man alive?
Yep. Just let me finish this page.
You're a horrible, conceited, good-for-nothing. And I don't love you. It's your money I'm after.
Hey, turn off the radio, will you? Get some music.
Genius is going to Betty Bye.
Don't. Let me finish this scene.
If he'd met you 10 years ago, I wouldn't have ulcers today.
What's my first name?
Hi.
Say hello to our guest.
Oh, hello, Mel. Hey, what are you doing up so late? Hey, can we have some coffee?
No, you're going to bed.
Well, it's not even dark outside.
That's because it's tomorrow. I mean, it's today. And you haven't been to sleep since yesterday.
If Brody could only see you now, would he be delighted?
I wonder. Anyway, we've got lots of pages for him.
Come on, and you're going to bed.
Don't let me alone. I'm going to kick you right out of here.
If you do, I'll go back to Chicago and be a Fuller Brush girl. They were crazy about my work in the near North Side.
You go when I tell you to go, and not before. Remember that.
I'll try.
You see, he's right.
He's right. Laurel mustn't do such a thing as thinking about her departure because apparently Hollywood needs the hopeful dreamers and prospective victims without whom it really wouldn't be Hollywood. Laurel Gray does try to escape nevertheless, and of course her one-way flight to New York is canceled at the very last moment. As punishment, I guess, for her naivete. There's more. Al Roberts, for instance, in Detour, follows his girlfriend from New York who is determined to make it in Hollywood, and as soon as he arrives, he is lost and will never find a way out again. Ruth Lanier, in To Live and Die in LA, wants nothing more than to get away as quickly as possible. And she packs her suitcase, but is being dragged back immediately into the hopeless spiral of exploitation, violence, and drugs that has been her life in Los Angeles all along. Walter Neff, in Double Indemnity, wants to escape over the border to Mexico, but he does not even make it from his office into the elevator. And Fantasia, Ray, and Pluto travel in one fall's move from Los Angeles back home, and home of all places is a place called Star City in Arkansas, and none of them survives. So there are scores of very sobering and frustrating images in the history of films about Los Angeles, but no image, I think, has ever truly captured the disillusion of those who were happily dreaming until just moments ago, like this one does from City of Angels. Without any shoes or money, disoriented, and the rain is coming down hard, this is where the former angel Seth finds himself after he had just become a human, at the city's edge, without the slightest clue how to live a life in Los Angeles or anywhere. And so on. There are so many more. All of these characters and so many more are incredibly tired. But nobody is more exhausted by Los Angeles than Raymond Chandler's private detective, Philip Marlowe. Whenever, in fact, he's reminded of the fact that the dream of Southern California has been lost for good. And this is true even for the white East Coast elite for whom this very state was meant to be, or wasn't it? Wasn't everything supposed to be going just perfectly in paradise for this class and especially for this complexion? In films like Murder, My Sweet and In the Big Sleep, in The Long Goodbye and in Farewell, My Lovely, Los Angeles drives Philip Marlowe out of his mind, but only in Lady in the Lake in 1947 does he finally draw consequences, and he finally leaves.
As for Adrian, there was only one hitch. DeGamo heard her telling Kane where I was, so he got to me first. Those things happen sometimes. But Adrian...
May I come in?
Yes, come in. You got the tickets?
Yes, to New York, one way.
You scared?
Yes, but it's wonderful.
And for all we know, they might even be fine. Who knows? So few LA noir characters afford themselves the luxury to specify a dream goal like the cab driver in Collateral does in 2006, who keeps a postcard of a Caribbean island behind the shade of his car. For most others, who are trapped in LA noir narratives, all that matters is to get away quickly. If there's time to define any goal at all, then it's either the respective little hometown, where a protective origin story awaits and some version of life and perspective and a solid past that might even be dealt with somehow. Or the goal is New York. Zabriskie Point, for instance. In this film, we notice a large American airline billboards on the side of the street, which says 27 times a day to New York, which is topped only later by United Airlines that says, let's get away from it all, New York. Sender, Chris Kraus. 2, Kevin Vennemann. Subject, buddy movie. Date, October 20th, 2011, 11:13 p.m. I kept thinking about it, and then I suddenly realized that I, until our trip a few years ago, used to believe that everyone was always traveling the other way around. People on the East Coast dreaming about a West Coast paradise, except for Joan Didion, of course. In Play It As It Lays, Mariah thinks about going to New York for a while to see some shows. But they all dreamed of the West Coast. At first, yes, but then they all want to go back. It's early 2008 when I first meet the art critic and novelist Chris Kraus over here in Topanga Canyon. Chris has lived here for 2 decades, has written a lot about Los Angeles and the art scene, and she runs a small radical theory press downtown. She seems to know pretty much everyone in town, and she seems to feel at home here. And I ask her what she thinks about this remarkably canonical desire to return in the movies from Los Angeles to New York. And why is it that she, Chris, escaped the other direction from New York to Los Angeles in the early 90s? A few days later, we, Chris and I, would embark on a long trip along Sunset Boulevard from west to east for the entirety of Los Angeles and then beyond Los Angeles, all the way to New York, where Chris promises she would show me just exactly why and where to everyone has been trying to escape LA Noir. Philip Marlowe does get only that one time in 1947 in all of the Raymond Chandler adaptations. But he constantly dreams of alternative paradises elsewhere. Toward the end of Farewell My Lovely, for instance, Marlowe stumbles from one idealized phantasma into the next. It's the summer of 1941. Baseball superstar Joe DiMaggio has been approaching the record for the longest series of home runs ever in professional baseball. He finally breaks the record on the very same day the Germans, with all their collective enthusiasm, invade the Soviet Union. And here is Philip Marlowe towards the end of the film.
But DiMaggio was still going strong, on his own record now. Would he hit safely in every game forever? It seemed that way. And why not? He was only 26 and playing baseball in the sunshine. He heard little boys cheer, not cry.
He's thinking about this little boy because just a few takes earlier in South Central Los Angeles, Marlowe had to comfort this boy who had been dreaming of a baseball career or becoming a professional baseball player and whose father had been murdered that same night in a gang violence-related incident. So thinking about this boy in this scene and reading about DiMaggio in the newspaper, Marlowe does not seem to have learned any lessons at all when he falls in love again, yet again, with the idea of another paradise on Earth. Because 3,000 miles away in the Bronx, where DiMaggio is playing for the New York Yankees. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for this beautiful reading. I mean, your readings are always special to me. When you read from Close to Dead Enough, it's so much about the rhythm of the prose of your first novel. There's a kind of hip-hop rhythm in Close to Dead Enough that comes clear, read aloud, right? And now it's the first time for me that I listen and watching you reading from this book, Sunset Boulevard, and it's full of references to films, and it's just beautiful. An experience how you use all the how you visualize, right? how you intersect your text with the film. So thanks so much for that. Well, since we celebrate 25 years of Villa Aurora, simple first question. Why did you apply in the first place for this program? Was it to pursue your career, and this is Villa Aurora a regular point of a career in literary writing in Germany, or was it rather for the United States or for the specific city?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a long time ago. I was here in 2008, so it's been 13 years. I don't know. I think it just seemed like, there's this like carousel of stipends and residencies that everyone who's trying to get by as a writer in Germany, Austria, Switzerland is on, and I guess you just circulate through all of these residencies and stipends, and you try every year, and you apply, and every once in a while you're lucky, and you're invited somewhere, or you're given some money, and I guess at the time, all I did was write, and I just applied for most of the things that seemed to be available. I think I had only been to Los Angeles before. And only for a couple of days. It seemed intriguing to be here and have a little more time to get to know the place a little better.
Yeah. Thank you. My other question is related to our topic of sanctuary. Recently I read your first novel again, Close to Jedineth, and that is also translated into English, by the way. And it's so much about also a very most fragile kind of architecture, a tree house. Mm-hmm. It even ends there, and it appears at a very early point in the novel, a tree house of two kids. And they say it is their castle, and we furnish it beautifully. What would you say? What is your path? The development from your first novel to Sunset Boulevard. Particularly, this is a book much about architecture, but the architectural element is already in your first book. So, how does that relate? What would you say?
I think. Both of these books, the novel Close to Jedineth and this essay collection, Sunset Boulevard, I think are probably, just to use the term, stories about failed refuges, if that's the plural of refuge, or like failed states of refuge, if you will. And I think the very plot and the political premise, I think, of Close to Jedineth did not really allow me to be very specific about what's even happening, because it's a very immediate quasi-stream of consciousness narrative, where the narrator themselves don't even really comprehend what's happening to them. They're not really able to get a grasp on the violence they're exposed to. And so there's very little by way of an explanation of the terms of the violence in this book, and of the reasons for why this specific refuge these two girls seek fails in the end, does not provide them with the kind of shelter they were seeking and building for themselves. And that's different probably in Sunset Boulevard, where in this essay collection I had a very distinct topic that I set out to, comprehend for myself and communicate. And a lot of research went into the book, obviously a lot of films and the secondary literature that comes with these films, but I think I was able to be a lot more specific about the violence that's so inherent in these films, and as well in the kind of process of the city that all of these films are set in. Like I haven't thought the sentence through. I was able to be much more explicit about the violence that is inherent in these films, but also in, I guess, the whole premise of the city itself and how it came about. Yeah. So specificity versus ambivalence. I think that's the difference between these two books.
Thank you very much for these first responses, and I think we can open Q&A to the floor here. There will be questions, remarks. Yes, the two of you.
There's a cadence to your writing in English. Is it the same in German? And also, what may have been the influences to that style?
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much for this question. I think it's very similar in German, even though as I found myself rewriting these couple of pages in English, I really, really wanted to capture the cadence of the original. It's not always possible. Some of the sentences turned out to be untranslatable. As I learned painfully when I gave the reading a test run this morning to an audience of one, and I was told this does not work, and so I had to make some edits. But yes, the cadence is very, very similar. Yeah, there's like a certain rhythm and certain flow, which I think when I started writing was going to be unique to this one first book, but then it turned out to be impossible for me to like separate myself from it. So unfortunately, it's now everywhere. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
I was surprised how much you immersed yourself into Hollywood history, film history. How deeply you seem to go into this. Was this a previous interest, or did you decide just when you got here that living here, you wanted to create something out of here?
Well, when I came here, I was primarily writing about architecture only, and not so much about film. And I wrote a couple of features for German public radio on modernist architecture in Israel, but also in Southern California and elsewhere. And so that's what I did mostly while I was here. I wrote on architecture, and I just went out to see houses most of the time. Conducted interviews, talked to the late photographer Julius Schulman, for instance, talked to Richard Neutra's son, a couple of other people. So that's mostly what I did here. And the films only came a couple years later. I only really started to write about the cinematic framework of the films, of the book a couple of years later, 2 or 3 years later, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
More questions, comments, observations? Maybe I can ask you about, well, your immigration history, right? Did this program encourage you to immigrate to the United States, or was that unconnected? Came that later, or did it just happen?
I moved to the U.S. permanently, I think a year later. I don't think it was connected necessarily. I had always, in the back of my head, I always wanted to like get my PhD at some point. It just worked out that way, that I started applying for schools here in the US. But I don't think it was necessarily connected. I don't know. Never thought about it.
More questions? Okay, let's close here. Thank you for your input. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.